Welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist on Facebook Live, where we answer common questions about atheism, freethinkers, and state-church separation. I'm Dan Barker. I'm co-president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces this weekly show.
I'm Elizabeth Cavell, Associate Counsel here at FFRF.
And I'm Andrew Seidel, FFRF's Director of Strategic Response.
And you guys have been really busy, especially this month. It's that time of year again where we pack the kids' lunches and we send them off to school. And for those of us in the state-church separation business, this is the beginning of a huge complaint season.
That's right. Every year, FFRF gets almost around 5,000 state church complaints, and many people may not know that around half of those complaints are about violations that are occurring in public schools.
So there's, I understand, about a dozen different types of state church complaints in the public schools, and you guys can maybe explain that a little bit more. But today, we're going to talk about just the top 5. The most common violations that we see, and these two talented attorneys will discuss why these are legally problematic and what can be done about them. So we're going to do a countdown. Are these the top 5 number of complaints or the top 5 egregiousness?
So this is a little bit of an amalgam. For the purpose of talking about as much as we can, we kind of lumped some categories together. But this is generally the top 5 that we send letters to public school districts about, and where there has been overlap with the top 5 most reported, we included those. But there are some categories where we receive a lot of reports, but for one reason or another, we can't always take action. So these are the ones that we're taking action on most, and especially within the last couple of years, and the ones that you are most likely to see that FFRF is most likely to be able to respond to.
Well, so let's count down, Andrew. Let's count down from 5 to 1. So let's start with number 5.
So number 5 is religious assemblies. And more we are hearing about religious assemblies during the school day. These are often mandatory, and they kind of come in various forms. We've seen a number of different iterations. We've seen strong men who go into the school and they rip phone books in half. Not that kids know what phone books are anymore. They rip them in half and then they preach about Jesus. We've seen Christian rappers go into the public school and rap about Jesus. And then they often do this other thing where they have an ostensibly secular program during the school day, and then they invite the kids to come to their after-school program, which is then highly religious and proselytizing.
I used to do that.
You used to do that?
I used to do that.
You were one of the violators?
Back in the 60s and early 70s, I was with some team, the God Squad team, and we would go in ostensibly for a drug assembly, how to keep kids off of drugs.
It's a popular one.
And so the principals in the schools, they would invite us in. I didn't realize that at the time that it was illegal. I just thought, oh, this is cool. But we did kind of tap down the religion, and we sang songs. But then we invited them, like you say, we invited them afterwards to this off-campus location where we could preach to them.
Yeah, so that's still highly problematic, even in that sort of secular iteration. And one of the big problems with this is the peer pressure that we see. And we actually have a good example of this that we saw, I think it was from last year, in Sylacauga, Alabama.
Right. So here's an example of an assembly, as Andrew mentioned, that's just straight up proselytizing. This is in a school gym in Alabama. I think it's a middle school, so I think we're talking 10 to 12-year-olds. And you can see everybody rushing down to the center stage, and there's a cross there. And I don't know if you can hear the chintzy music in the background, but it's full on worship music. Everyone's now kneeling. They're praying. As far as we know, or as far as students and parents could tell, this assembly appeared to be mandatory. It happened in the middle of the school day. And of course, kids don't have a very discerning way of understanding what's school sponsored in the middle of the school day and what's not school sponsored, when everyone in the school, including teachers and faculty, are saying, get up, we're all going to file down to the gym. And everybody does that. So that was an example of just a full-on unlawful religious assembly with religious content. It was just worship songs and prayer right
Pretty
there
bad
in
worship
the middle
song, actually.
Was that
of
an
the school
altar
day.
call, Dan? Is that what that
Yeah, that is kind of an altar call, but that music is some of the most boring music. It's just one chord on the guitar to try to, you know, but
Yeah. So we've got lots of objections.
artistic objections
even if
as
the
well.
music were good, we'd still object, right?
So that was really a stunning visual,
It was.
and one of the more egregious examples of an in-school assembly that just has flat out religious content and is just completely unconstitutional. But what we see more often and is a little bit more insidious is what Dan used to do, which is it's a ministry that's sort of offering the secular service to public schools, and what they do is purportedly talk about some secular topic, and it's kind of a grab bag of whatever the school wants, you know, drug abuse, bullying, suicide, character, anything
character's the big one.
Character. Anything you could think of that's sort of secular, they'll talk about in sort of veiled terms without really directly referencing religion.
But we didn't know what we were doing. We
Yeah.
were just members of this
Of course.
evangelistic team, and we were not experts in drug abuse or anything. We learned a few little stories that would scare
Right.
the kids. But then we'd say, but there is an answer.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to know the answer? Come to our meeting afterwards. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing I think that's really important to point out here, and you know, we've talked about sort of the two different kinds of violations here, where Dan's violation, sorry Dan, now that's what,
I confessed my sins
He's atoning.
years ago.
and then the straight up proselytizing that we saw in Silicagua. You know, voluntariness is not an excuse. And that's one of the themes that we're going to see throughout the school violations. You know, those kids in middle school, once one or two of their peers ran up to bow down before that cross, you know, it opens the floodgates. Who wants to be the one or two kids that's Jewish kids or secular kids sitting in the stands not participating and outing themselves like this? And courts have been very clear that whether or not assemblies like that are voluntary, or any of these religious infiltrations in the public schools, whether or not any of them are voluntary, they are still violations of the establishment.
Because
clause
the
of First
fact that the
Amendment.
school invited them in the first place, the kids go, oh, the school invited these people.
Yeah, so just because you see something in your public school and think, well, it might be voluntary, that does not necessarily excuse the violation by any stretch.
Particularly assemblies that are happening during the school day, and what to look for in these sort of below the radar, you know, ministry targeting assemblies is an assembly where your child comes home with sort of an invitation for something else that sounds really super cool. You know, there were
pizza.
skateboarders and like X Games guys at school today, and they did this, and this, but you know, they said there's going to be so much more of that tonight if we just go at 7 o'clock to, you know, so-and-so church, or even sometimes back to the school.
Back to the school is often the case.
Gym. And then that event is a full-on conversion event. It's an altar call. I mean, that is an overtly religious event where the ministry is doing their evangelism, trying to, you know, win souls for Jesus. And it's really just inappropriate and, in our view, unconstitutional for schools to give ministry groups access to their students during the school day for the purpose of basically recruiting them to these conversion
Well, and they
events.
say, come tonight for free pizza and
big
Coke,
popular
you know,
one,
and so, wow, let's go to
and a
this.
concert, or, you know, a strongman show, or
So
an
are
X
we
Games.
stopping some of these?
Yeah,
what
we-
can people do? What's
Yeah,
happening?
we are stopping a lot of these. And I think the number one thing that people need to take away from this is if you are concerned that there's a violation in your school district, go to the FFRF website, go to the legal tab, and then click report a state church violation. It should be very easy to find and highlighted. We will look into it, investigate it, and usually write a letter to the school so that you don't have to out yourself, and we will work to get this stopped. Obviously, it's better if you can tell us in advance, because then we actually have a chance to get it stopped. But we have been very successful in stopping these violations.
Somebody was complaining about I think you called it Bible Man in Tennessee, or was it, or
Yeah.
That's Alabama.
in Alabama?
And Tennessee.
Yeah, and we're still working on
still
that.
working
And
on that one.
sometimes,
The Todd Becker Foundation was
Yeah.
a bad one, where they, they're going into the public schools and they're having these one-on-one, really intimate chats where they're like touching the children. It's very disturbing. Some of the things that some of the violations we see.
right. So if an assembly has happened already and you're learning about it after the fact, we'd still like to know. We'd like to write to the district, explain the agenda behind these
And the
groups,
problem.
and ask them to ensure that these groups are not invited back, because of course we know these groups are targeting the same schools every couple of years or every year, and so it's still worthwhile to warn school districts about
Absolutely.
what the true purpose is or what the true agenda is for these ministry groups that are coming in to talk about secular things. And we've had school districts who are telling, who will, tell one of these groups like, okay, we want your character assembly, come into our schools, talk about drug use, but listen, you can't give any invitations, you can't invite students to other events, and you can't recruit for other events or hand things out. And suddenly, those groups are not so interested in
Yeah.
giving secular assemblies. I mean, the purpose of getting into schools is that's where the kids are. That's where they're required by law to be.
A mission field.
It is.
That's how we saw it. There's all this mission field.
That's
so
where they are.
basically, it's illegal. It's against the law to
Absolutely.
do that.
And
Right.
one final note before we move on to number 4, schools sometimes pay these groups a lot of money for this. We're talking thousands of dollars that public school money is going to these groups to then have the groups turn
Yeah.
around and preach to the kids.
Well,
which
then
is also a
let's go
problem.
in and preach. So what's
that's a good point.
what's number 4 on the countdown?
So here we go. Number 4, religious clubs. So again, this is, there's a few different types of violations under this umbrella, but we're hearing about this. This is coming up sort of more and more. It may be one of two general things. It could be an actual sort of school-sponsored religious club, and that's most often going to be in an elementary school where the age of the students makes it very unlikely that a truly student-initiated club could exist. And then the other situation is where we do have a student-run club, or what should ostensibly be a student-run club, usually at the high school level and sometimes in middle schools. But school staff are really heavily involved. Like teachers are just running the clubs, or they're participating in the clubs heavily beyond supervisory participation, or they're recruiting students to come to the club and things like that.
So, yeah, well, I was just going to say, I think it's important for people when they're reporting it to us. It's because this is a little bit confusing,
Yep.
and some clubs are okay if it's actually student run and in the high school. We need to know as much detail as you can provide us.
Right.
But an elementary school religious club is always going to be out of bounds. Middle school religious clubs are often going to be out of bounds, though not always. It depends on how state law defines a secondary school. High school clubs are probably okay as long as teachers aren't really and staff aren't really involved in them.
But don't they need to have an advisor, at least on some of these campuses?
Yes, they do.
Right. So most extracurricular clubs are going to have a faculty advisor, and that's a supervisory role. So that means maybe that teachers that are faculty sponsors can sit in on meetings in a supervisory role, but they shouldn't have any sort of participation in the club. Certainly not leadership. Certainly not, recruiting guests, or lining up food, or recruiting students to meetings. I mean, they shouldn't be participating in club activities at all if it's a religious club. And it's a very common violation to see teacher involvement. I mean, that's kind of a red flag for parents. Is if you are getting a sense that a teacher is leading or just overly involved in a religious club, or the school is involved. And there are some clues to that. I mean, if you get a permission slip from your kid's elementary school saying, we have an after-school Bible club, sign this and return it to, Mr. Smith, that's a clue that the school is involved in the administration of a religious club. So if you can sort of gather what the details are, we can look at it further and usually write to the district and get those club stopped.
Yeah, I mean, basically, the teachers are there to make sure the kids don't burn the school down. That's the long
Basically,
and
yeah,
short of it. If
just
they're
to
doing more than that, it is a problem. And there's one other sort of outgrowth that we see of this. We often see outside groups coming in and using the school, renting the school. Sometimes we'll see this with churches. The Fellowship of Christian Athletes is one of these that is often a student-led club in some districts, but is also an outside group coming in and renting the school in other districts. And sometimes they try to completely blur the lines, and they're doing both, which is also problematic. So again, when you're reporting this to FFRF through the website, it's important to give us as much information as you can so that we can really fully investigate.
So there was a case a couple of decades ago, the Mergen decision, that we don't really like, but it says as long as a school allows non-curricular clubs and activities on campus, they cannot exclude religious groups. So if they have a chess club or some other non-curricular, Bible clubs can come in after hours, right?
Yeah, so this is why students and genuine student-led clubs are allowed to form. And the Mergen's decision was based on a law called the Equal Access Act. And that law was passed, it was a direct response to courts saying that you can't have religious clubs in a public school no matter what, because that violates state-church separation. So Congress stepped in and passed this law called the Equal Access Act, which said you did a great job describing it. The one interesting thing about it is that it was passed to foster Christian clubs in public school, but it's kind of backfired a little bit. This is the law that lets secular student alliances form in public high schools. It's the law that lets gay-straight alliances form in public high schools.
And we've read that some schools actually stopped the whole policy because they didn't want to allow the liberal and the gay groups to come in, so they stopped all non-curricular groups.
Absolutely. It's just and I wrote about this a long time ago, but it's an example of the short-sightedness of the legal strategy on the religious right. They are just in it for the particular moment. They're not thinking long-term with their strategy. And we're actually seeing that right now with the attempt to redefine religious freedom. They're not thinking about what's going to happen with a concept of religious freedom that lets anybody exempt themselves from the secular law when they are no longer the majority, which is coming very soon.
Yeah. So again, with clubs, the key is truly student-initiated clubs that are non-curricular have a right to form. They can't be discriminated against based on the viewpoint of the club, whether it's religious or whether it's for LGBT students. But that is really only an issue. The Equal Access Act only applies to secondary schools. That means high schools, and in limited states, it means middle schools. When you're seeing religious clubs in elementary schools, whether there are other non-curricular clubs or not, the whole concept of student-initiated becomes a really different kind of argument. And in our view,
the Good News clubs, are they student-initiated?
No, so good news clubs are what I was talking about with an outside group coming in and renting the public school. And then hosting an event, because those are almost always happening, as Liz was pointing out, in elementary schools. So those are not, there's no way for an elementary school student to form and lead a club. That just doesn't happen.
Unless their pastor father says, here's how you do it, kind of thing. They, urge them on.
And that's why the Equal Access Act only applies to secondary schools, which most states define as high schools. Some states also lump middle schools in there.
But Good News Clubs is a good example of where the lines get blurred, because we get lots of reports from school districts where there is a teacher sending home permission slips for students to go to Good News Club, or sending home advertisements, not third-party, literature distribution, but actually the school kind of coordinating attendance at Good News Club meetings, and that's out of bounds. So if the clues are towards, school sponsorship, and you're sort of getting the vibe of school involvement in a religious club, you should report that to us with all the details.
And we're thinking about challenging this whole thing with a best news club, where we would have curriculum that comes in and see how they would like an atheist, agnostic, secular person having access to the mission field of young students. We have stopped a few of these, haven't we? The one in Mississippi, the kindergarten in Mississippi, where the teachers were
The law is pretty clear, actually, once you understand it. It can be confusing to sit here and explain, but once you understand it and can peg how this club is organized and where it's supposed to sit, the law is pretty clear, and it's easy for us to stop these violations, usually with just a letter pointing out what the law says.
Yeah,
Right.
Clubs aimed at elementary schoolers that are like Bible study clubs, or
Yeah.
Christian clubs. We've convinced school districts that those are out of bounds for elementary schoolers.
Oh, very good.
So that's religious clubs.
So number 3.
So school Bible distributions, this is something that we often see happening. We often see, for instance, the Gideons going into public schools and handing out Bibles to other people's children. It's incredibly predatory. Parents typically teach their kids not to accept things from strangers, but you see these outside groups using the machinery of the state to promote their holy book.
Right.
And there are some caveats on this one. FFRF's stance, and the courts back us up on this, is that Bible distributions happening on school property are always unconstitutional. Most of the time, we're able to back that up.
Right. We're amazed, though, at how often, and this is still in the top 5, how often we're still hearing about Bible distributions that are actually taking place on campus, in school classrooms, in school hallways, and things like that. This remains a really, really common violation, not only for groups or because of groups like the Gideons, but other religious groups and sort of rogue school staffers.
And one thing that we often see, we don't often see it, I shouldn't say that. One thing that we do see, Gideons who are smart. This is Gideons International. These are the same people that put the Bible in your hotel bedside table. They'll sometimes stand on the public sidewalk and try to pass these Bibles out. That could be a problem if they're impeding the walkway and they're harassing students, things like that. But typically, they are going to have a First Amendment right to stand there and do that. It's when they're actually using the schools that become a problem.
Right.
And
we're hearing we get more reports of Bible distributions than we are able to respond to, because oftentimes people are reporting Gideons that are on public sidewalks, but right outside of public schools, just adjacent to the school, so that every student coming in and out and parents driving up to the school sort of has to be confronted with them. And creepy and predatory as that is, courts have and would protect their right to be on public sidewalks, which is considered by courts to sort of be the ultimate public forum, the ultimate public square for speech. But if, as they often do, and we find with the Gideons, they will do what they can get away with in a particular school. Mm-hmm. If they're encroaching onto school property at all, meaning they're in the parking lot, or they're on the lawn, or they're just standing outside the doors, we can complain.
And one thing that you mentioned public forums, and this is another caveat that we sometimes see with these Bible distributions, where we'll write to a school district and say, hey, we understand you have a Bible distribution going on. That's not allowed. It's not permitted under the Constitution. They'll respond and say, oh, no, we'll let anybody distribute any kind of literature in our public schools. And this happened to us in Orange County, Florida.
A public forum doctrine, basically.
And this is nonsense when it comes to the public schools. It's not a legit doctrine. We decided to challenge it in court. We did that by asking to distribute our own literature, which they said we could.
Well, this was passive distribution, right? It wasn't like handing it out.
Yeah, now, passive versus active distribution it's an artificial difference that we don't think courts are going to care about. This is the idea of setting things up on a table and letting students take them versus going into the classroom and handing them out. It doesn't matter. You can't have Bible distributions on school property. But Orange County Public Schools in Florida said, we'll let anybody distribute anything. So we submitted a bunch of books, including Thomas Paine's Rights of Man, Sam Harris's Letter to a Christian Nation, some of our non-tracts, and they said, actually, just about everything you submitted to us, we cannot distribute. They censored it.
It's obscene, right? Or it's likely to cause a disturbance on campus.
Age inappropriate was another popular
Right.
reason. There was one where they said that the idea that Christ was not crucified and not resurrected was age inappropriate for children.
That he was not.
That he was not. So saying that somebody was tortured, murdered, and then rose zombie-like from the dead was perfectly okay for the age of those students, but saying that that didn't happen was age inappropriate, which is just, it's absurd. So we sued them in federal court. They ended up changing their policy and caving and basically saying, okay, you can distribute everything, fine. And the whole time we've been pointing out to them, look, you don't have to have Bible distributions. You shouldn't. This is unconstitutional. Just stop.
Yeah, because we don't want to do this either.
There's no such thing as a public forum. Just stop. Every single step along the way, we said this. And finally, the day came when we distributed our literature. And the next day, we mentioned to our friends at the Satanic Temple that this was a possibility, that anybody could come in. And they asked to distribute their coloring books. And lo and behold, the school board shut down the forum, stopped all the Bible distributions, all the literature distributions.
That's one way without going. Well, we did go to court, though.
We had to go to court on that one. But again, if they had just listened to us in the first place, when we continually pointed out, just don't have these distributions in your public schools, they're illegal.
Right.
It wouldn't have been a problem.
And this is a commonly used device, the school district saying, look, we've opened a limited public forum for outside groups to set up tables with literature, and we're not going to discriminate against groups, and using that as a device for keeping Bibles in their schools. So we've had to get creative for finding ways to demonstrate to school districts why that's a really bad idea.
And if that is happening, people should still report it to us and not run off trying to do that on their own. It can get confusing, and we can be very helpful and provide the literature and do all the coordinating that needs to be done. So.
Right. We should note that, again, our lawsuit in Orange County and sort of this concept that we're talking about with the public forums in schools is mostly battling out in high schools. This kind of shenanigans shouldn't be happening in elementary schools.
Yeah, and we always say that no matter what, any kind of Bible distribution is unconstitutional, no matter what school it's in. So.
Right. So you should be particularly vigilant about any Bible distributions happening, or passive literature distributions happening in elementary schools. But this is happening, as much as ever in public schools. So be on the lookout for, Bibles in your kids' backpacks.
Be vigilant, because the Gideons are really slippery. If one school complains, well, they'll just move to another school and wait until they get in trouble there, then they'll move to another school.
Yep.
So we have to watch that.
And complaining really is successful, so let us know and we'll do what we can.
So we're counting down to the number two.
I think we're number 2, religious displays in the public schools. We actually hear about this pretty regularly. It's surprising. We've seen all manner of displays in the public schools, Bible verses. We sued over a couple of large Ten Commandments monuments in Pennsylvania school districts, and because the law here is very clear, we were able to get
Where's
those.
that standing right there?
This is in either the New Kensington or Connellsville school district.
But that's a high school?
It's right.
That's New Ken and New Kensington School District, and it's on school property, right? That's the high school.
Students have
there.
to walk right by it to get into the door. And it begins, "I am the Lord thy God," and there's our brave plaintiff,
shot.
Marie Schaub, champion of the First Amendment, who was our plaintiff. We were able to sue over this Ten Commandments monument and get it removed.
Is she standing where it used to be?
Yep, that's the
same
after.
spot after shot, and that was a few years of litigation trying to get those removed, because unlike many of the displays we hear about, those are however many ton granite monuments that have been in that spot on campus for who knows how long, but they were not willing to move those without a fight. But the law is very clear. There are cases right on point when it comes to public schools. Public schools are different. This kind of display is not tolerated in a public school. There's really no secular purpose to have one religion's,
and we see it everywhere. We see crosses, we see Bible verses.
Right.
We've seen teachers prominently displaying "In God We Trust," which people who are paying attention know that this is a new push that we're seeing in the legislatures. There's a project by the religious right called Project Blitz, where they're trying to get "In God We Trust" displayed in public schools. It's very difficult to challenge.
That's a whole other issue area.
Yeah, and we'll probably do a whole thing on that sometime. We actually have a press release on that people should go check out on our website if they want to understand what's going on there.
Yeah, that's a unique problem. But But religious displays generally, it's all over school campuses, and these are very frequently reported in lots of different contexts. You saw a monument on outside of school property, but on campus, but we see this posters in classrooms, crosses and other sort of decorative religious artwork in classrooms or in school hallways, or I had one in a bathroom.
The Jesus painting in Ohio.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
That was a very popular one.
The picture of Jesus hanging on the wall in the
Yeah,
hallway.
the blue-eyed, white, blonde-haired Jesus that we had to sue over.
Yeah, that was in a middle school hanging in a hallway, just a painting of Jesus.
Wasn't
And-
it the Hall of Honor or something?
No,
like
you're
that?
thinking of something
Oh,
else.
okay.
No.
There's too many of them.
I know there are.
Keep
there
track
are.
of.
There are.
But didn't they say it's not religious? This is a memorial to some student who was killed in a car accident.
Or
and-
it was a gift.
It was
a
by a
gift from a
class.
student group, and it's been here since time immemorial. And all of these things are not relevant when we're talking about
It doesn't
religious
matter.
displays, especially something as sectarian as basically a shrine to Jesus
Yeah, or a
in a
Ten
public
Commandments
school. And that goes for a hallway or a classroom or, the school exterior, Bible verses and plaques and Ten Commandments displays and crosses and anything else. We've been pretty successful getting those removed when they're pointed out to school districts. So if you see something like that on your public school campus, you should report that to FFRF.
Get a picture if you can and report it with
I
the
think
picture.
one of the values of what you guys are doing is we take a case. It's hard because it's expensive and time consuming, and we win the case.
Yes.
And we can point out the school district had to pay X number of tens of thousands of dollars defending a losing case.
Right.
And the same Jesus painting, if I remember correctly, showed up in a school in Kansas.
Yeah.
And we were able to send a letter and say, hey, do you want to fight this? Because look what happened in Ohio.
Right. And
How much did they spend?
Ohio was a great example. I think they ended up paying
95.
close to 100 grand, between 80 and 100 grand. And that was, that ended on summary
Really,
judgment or
I think
before
it-
summary
Yeah,
judgment.
it's settled, I thought.
So that's not a lot of litigation, generated a lot of fees. And because they lost in the end, the school district had to pay those fees to the ACLU and the Freedom from Religion Foundation for that lawsuit, which could have been as simple as them receiving our letter and just, taking the thing off the wall.
Well, that's what they did in Kansas. In Kansas, they said, we're not going down that. We're going to just take it.
Right.
In Ohio, was the insurance company involved? Didn't they step in and say, we're not going to cover you for this?
Insurance companies are often involved in litigation. That's a whole, we could do, that's a show I don't think people would be terribly interested in. But yeah, oftentimes an insurance company they don't want to have an ideological religious fight over whether or not to keep some. And the ridiculous thing about that was that exact portrait had been declared unconstitutional in a public school by the federal circuit court, so the second highest court in the United States, that had jurisdiction over that same school.
Right. In other words,
it was
the law was settled.
completely settled issue. So of course
The law was settled.
Yeah, and no insurance company is going to say, yeah, go ahead, have that ideological fight so that you can remain popular with your religious base. That's not going to happen ever.
So legal action creates a useful precedent for not for bullying, as they call us, but for convincing school
For
districts
upholding the First Amendment.
to do the right thing.
yeah.
Right. It's unfortunately, it's true that a school district that wants to make an ideological stand, especially when people in the district are kind of clamoring for not caving in to the out-of-town atheists. Sometimes the school district, the only thing they understand is the bottom line and the pocketbook, and I think rightfully taxpayers are really tired of that school districts wasting money on lawsuits that shouldn't take place in the first place.
The money issue can give them an out or a way to save face, because the principal or the mayor or whatever case can say, hey, I wanted Jesus, but we can't afford it.
Exactly.
So vote for me again. I still want Jesus, but reelect me, but we don't want to waste all this money.
And
Right,
they often
exactly.
do that.
Exactly.
And one thing I'll point out too, since we're talking about this, is we often have, not often, we sometimes, occasionally have had members of school boards and city councils, and in one case, a mayor, contact us and say, this is going on in my town. I need you to write a letter and provide me political cover so we can stop doing it. And we've done that. So, the complainant, we always have a local complainant, and the complainant could be the person who's bad-mouthing us.
Because they do need the politics of being, who wants to be the principal that kicked Jesus out of the schools?
Yeah, who
right?
wants to stand up for the First Amendment?
Right, exactly.
So are we getting down to the number one here in a
I
second?
think we are. I think we're
here
there.
we go. And this is a big category.
School-sponsored
prayers.
That was cute, Bruce. Ta-da!
So yeah, this old thing. And this is a big category that encompasses a lot of different things that you might be seeing in a public school that are unfortunately so very common. It's terrible that our number one violation category is also
broad.
probably it's broad, but it's also probably one of the most settled points
absolutely.
of law that there is in the Establishment Clause jurisprudence, which is that school-sponsored prayer is unconstitutional. But this category encompasses a lot of things. It includes prayer at school events, including graduations and athletic events, other school-sponsored events like awards, banquets, assemblies, staff meetings that open or close with prayer, scheduled prayer. But this also includes prayer where school staff are participating with students, praying with students, either leading them in prayer or participating in their prayer circles. You see an article here about a football team, prayer on a football team where, coaches and staff are participating, whether they're leading or not. All of these things have been held unconstitutional in violation of the Establishment Clause by federal courts, and some of these, the Supreme Court, prayer at graduations, prayer at athletic events. This is very common. All of these categories are very common, particularly prayer and athletics, coaches participating in prayer, and prayer at graduations.
Yeah, and the important thing I think for everybody to understand here is that prayer is fine at a public school, and there's like an old joke about, Dan, you probably know it.
As long as there are tests, there will be prayer at school.
Yeah. Students can pray at school if they want to. We've never said otherwise. We will never argue otherwise. If a student wants to go down to lunch and say a little prayer before they eat, fine. We don't care. We are talking about school-sponsored prayers.
Right.
And another important caveat, what you're talking about is, if the students do get together for a legitimate prayer, if the lunch table wants to say a prayer, say, a teacher can't then go sit down with those students and join them in prayer. Same thing with the teams. If a football team wants to have a prayer, they can do that.
Right.
But then a coach can't go and join in on that prayer. If they
Right.
want to gather around the flagpole, which we often see, and have a prayer before school, fine. Teachers and staff can't get involved.
Well, because they use this as a kind of a wink, wink. Hey, this is student-led. See, I'm the coach, but I can't help it if the players all want to get together and pray, and we're a team.
And
Right.
that's been a big, there's a big case out of the Ninth Circuit right now in Bremerton. This coach said he was just going down to the 50-yard line at the end of every game just by himself and praying, and it's not his fault that all the students came and felt like they had to join him and felt pressured.
But he was on duty. He was the coach, and it was an official school function.
Right.
So he was just breaking the law all by itself.
And that's exactly what
Right.
the court said.
Right. So, the thing to look for is, does the prayer, the religious activity, sort of have the stamp of approval of the school? And that means are school staffers who represent the school and are acting in their official capacity, coaches at a football game, teachers during the school day, or right before the school day. They represent the school during those times, and so if they're engaging in prayer, they are endorsing religion. They're making a show of their religiosity, and they're showing students what their religious preference is, and that's out of bounds.
And you can't believe some of the things we've seen. I mean, we had a family in Georgia who came to us, and we ended up filing a lawsuit on their behalf because the first grade teacher and the kindergarten teacher were telling all the first graders and kindergartners that they had to pray before they would go down to lunch. So, I mean, these kids don't know anything about it, and this is a teacher telling them what to do. I mean, it's coercion of the worst kind. that we're seeing, and it's also a complete violation of parental rights. So this is one of the most prevalent violations that we get in-house. We break it down into all manner of coach prayer,
Right.
But it was also
prayer, et cetera. But this is
divisive, and it led to a little bit of like
Bullying.
bullying, and your family's going to hell because you don't want to pray.
Absolutely. I mean, religion is divisive. This is one of the reasons the founders chose to separate state and church in the first place. And when you inject it into a public school where, I mean, first of all, there's immense peer pressure for kids to conform, bullying is rampant. It's going to alienate children. There's no way around that. If you inject religion in the public schools, kids are going to be alienated, and it's going to lead to bullying. And we've seen this actually time and time again. And we've even seen schools refuse to act on bullying reports that have arisen because they're injecting religion into the public schools. And
So what about
come down hard on them?
What about voluntary? Some schools allow students to say a prayer over the loudspeaker before a football game, for example.
Not okay. Unconstitutional.
Right.
But why? The student is doing it themselves. It's not the school. It's not a teacher. It's not a principal.
Sure. I mean, but they're using the machinery of the state. They're using the school resources to literally amplify their prayer and impose it on everybody else and impose it on other people's children.
Because it's an official function.
Absolutely. And the Supreme Court has decided that case.
You don't get things over the loudspeaker without, getting the stamp of approval from the school. That's what the reasonable person in the stands that hears something over the loudspeaker, especially a student being allowed to get their hands on a microphone. Everyone in the stands knows.
Imagine what could happen.
The school approved this message. Not like, oh, I guess little Johnny wanted to say something.
Yeah.
It's got the stamp of approval of the school. Everyone knows that, and courts have recognized that. So yeah, prayer over the loudspeaker is an official part of a school-sponsored event, and so prayer is not okay.
Yeah.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but in that Supreme Court case, Santa Fe, Texas, where they were praying over the loudspeakers, there was some divisiveness and some complaints from students and families in the school, and they were not atheists.
No.
Or not even Jewish families.
No, the plaintiffs there was a Mormon family and a Catholic family were the plaintiffs in that case that didn't want prayer imposed on their children. And incidentally, Donald Trump's nominee for the Supreme Court, Brett Kavanaugh, wrote a brief saying that prayer should certainly be allowed. And he actually went after those families with some pretty rough language. And people really ought to be calling their senators to oppose his nomination. And check out FFRF's action alerts on our website so that you know what to say, but you really need to be doing that.
So isn't it because the Mormons and the Catholic families were really uncomfortable with a predominantly like Southern Baptist kind of prayer being used?
Right.
It wasn't their prayer.
Exactly.
So you can't blame us atheists for that case.
Yeah, I mean, and it just goes to the point
We're not
earlier.
the only ones that don't want a specific religious orthodoxy pressed on our children. I mean, there are other religious groups who, if you're not the dominant, religious orthodoxy in that community, then that prayer or religious exercise, doesn't speak to you. It's not what you want your children to be confronted with at school-sponsored events. I mean,
Religion is divisive.
So we're
Very
going to
simple.
take questions here really quick. But those are just the top 5. We have a pamphlet that we make available.
top 10 public school state church violations. And we actually sell this in big bundles on our website if you want to
Pass them out.
Educate your school district. Go to the school board meeting.
evangelize a little bit, and also just kind of educate people in your public school district, other parents what to look out for, stuff like what we've been talking about today, and then some other issues that crop up a year in and year out.
That's good. So, or if you want, I'll send you a free one. If you just write to me, I'll send you one copy. But we want the literature to get out there. We have some questions from viewers today. Mark Howsam, is that how you say your name, Mark?
He can't answer.
Mark is asking, is it legal for a church to rent space in a public school for religious events?
Yeah, so this is a really frustrating one, and everybody, we should have said this at the beginning, but if you have questions like this, we have a page on our website, Legal, and then there's a State Church FAQ, Frequently Asked Questions, and a lot of your legal questions are probably answered there, including this one.
Right.
Generally, unfortunately, the Supreme Court has said that churches can rent public schools if the public school opens itself for rentals of everything. But they have to pay a fair market price. They can't get any special treatment, and then we often see that is the case. So when it comes to school rentals, we often require our complainant to do a lot of the legwork and look at the records and find out what the extent of any violation might be, because it can be
Let me say
onerous.
something here.
Go ahead. Yeah.
This is one where top 5, definitely in the top 5 of most reported to us, issues. It's not one of the top 5 that we're often able to act on, because courts have ruled that these sort of rental policies where schools open up their facilities and take rent for private groups to use their facilities not during school hours. Courts have said that's okay, and churches can't be excluded from that. So it's very, very common for churches to plant in school facilities and have their Sunday worship services there. But there are a lot of violations that can take place that are sort of ancillary to this reality, which is they get the space during the rental period, but if they're leaving behind signs or trailers or religious artifacts or their banners advertising their services, and those are staying up during the week, and when students are in school and just generally outside the rental period, that's something that we will complain to school districts about, and that's something that school districts should not be allowing.
Yeah, we've been successful with those complaints.
Or
quite a
what
bit.
what if the church isn't paying fair rent?
Yeah, then that's a problem.
Or what
too.
if the school is giving some kind of preference to the church?
Right.
Also a problem.
If you suspect something like that, you can request records. All of this is public record, contracts and, what the rental rates are, receipts for payment from churches. But churches are using school facilities on Sundays for worship services. So if you're not a person that drives around on Sunday to school, you shouldn't really know it. So if you're seeing signs during the week at your student's school and that's how you're learning about it, you should still report that to us and
You
let us look
remember
into it.
our member, an activist member, Mitch Kale in Hawaii, uncovered the fact that the schools were being shortchanged.
Right,
And
right.
by I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of
I
dollars.
thought it was upwards of $5 million by the end of it. I could be wrong
Yeah.
on that. Maybe don't
So
quote me.
the churches were taking advantage and not really paying their fair share.
Right.
Okay, another question. Lisa Paris with 2 R's. What about these meet me at the pole events where it's the teachers and parents and children, they say it's optional?
Yep.
Yeah.
This is great, actually, because See You at the Pole is also one of our top 5 most reported about issues, not necessarily where we're often able to complain, but there are plenty of instances when we're able to complain. See You at the Pole is this national phenomenon. Every, the first
I can't remember
something
now. It's
in
coming
September.
Up.
Yeah, it's coming up.
Thursday or something.
First Thursday in September, or second or third Thursday in September.
Someday in
I'm
September.
keyed into it. Yeah, look it up. See You at the Pole. And it's basically supposed to be this movement. It's supposed to be student initiated and student run, where students gather on such and such a day around their flagpole before school starts and say a prayer. It's not supposed to include outside adults. It's not supposed to include school staff. And like all student prayer, teachers and school staffers are not permitted to participate with students in See You at the Pole.
And importantly, See You at the Pole, the national organization, recognizes that fact and actually says that there should be no staff participation in their
Right,
materials.
check out their website.
And we also have an FAQ on See You at the Pole on our website, so
Right.
people can go learn
Obviously,
more there.
schools shouldn't be promoting this. They shouldn't be putting something on Facebook that says, remember, students, See You at the Pole is tomorrow. Join us at 7 a.m. This should not be school sponsored. It should not be school promoted. It's supposed to be a student initiative. You shouldn't be hearing about it from your schools or teachers.
But it does look like it's an outside group treating the school like a mission field, because there's visibility. Just before the bell rings, there's all these kids around the pole
Right,
praying, and so it's like a chance to kind of get in.
Right.
that's-
They're driving
that's the
students to do it, but at least it ostensibly is supposed to be a student movement, and they at least, on their materials, See You at the Pole encourages students to be the drivers of it. They encourage adults to step back, especially adults at the school.
But if they don't, we'll complain.
So theoretically, it's legal, but it's problematic on so many issues.
Right, it raises a lot of
practically
issues,
problematic.
and it creates a situation that religious teachers just can't resist participating in. And so if you see that, please report that to us.
Because God is good. Religion is good. Students need it to stay off drugs and to stop having premarital sex. I mean, religion is going to improve our school. Yeah. Okay, so another question. Tammy Sheehan Bartberger. Thanks for watching, Tammy. Can you talk about the movement to teach creationism in science classes, presumably public school
Great
science
question.
classes?
This is one that didn't make the cut in terms of most commonly acted on violations, but it's still pretty common. We hear about creationism being taught in public schools still, and just generally religious assignments and
Bible classes.
Yeah. And Bible curriculum.
I mean, the law here is actually pretty clear.
Yep.
It is teach, don't preach. If you teach about the Bible in public school, that would be fine, but you can't preach the Bible as though it is truth. You can educate, but not indoctrinate. Creationism, all of the ilk, the spin-offs
Intelligent
of creationism,
design.
yeah, all of that, completely unconstitutional. That is a religious theory. I don't even know if it counts as a theory, definitely not in the scientific sense, that is masquerading as science, and then courts have struck that down constantly. And we were talking earlier about how much money this can cost school districts. The school district that lost the case on intelligent design, they had to fork over more than $1 million to the plaintiff. So it's a costly fight for school districts.
In Dover, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, in Dover versus Kitzmiller.
So teach, not
2005.
preach. Does that apply in the science classroom? Couldn't a science teacher legitimately exclude creationism from the class?
Absolutely. I mean, but then they're teaching science. So I mean, when we're talking about, you can teach religion, you can't preach religion. You can educate about religion, but you can't indoctrinate a child into a religion.
So what kind of class could you teach religion, if not the science class?
I mean, so for instance, we see Bible classes pop up all around the country. This is one of those, it's kind of like See You at the Pole. In theory, a Bible class could be fine. Kids could learn about the literature in the Bible, how it was written, things like that. In practice, it's almost never taught the way it needs to be taught. It's almost always unconstitutional.
Right. It's hard to imagine a bona fide comparative religion class taught to kindergartners.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you see a Bible curriculum or a comparative religion course that's being aimed at, lower elementary school kids, that raises our suspicion in terms of how it's being taught and what the purpose of it is.
And we've stopped these. We stopped the Bible class that was pushed by Hobby Lobby in Mustang, Oklahoma a number of years ago.
Mustang?
It was a ridiculous course. We were suing over a Bible class in West Virginia.
Right.
These are absolutely things that can be stopped.
But creationism, religion being taught in the science classroom as though it's science, or the idea that there's some kind of controversy regarding evolution. All of those types of that's theology, and courts have recognized that. There is no sort of like religious right or free exercise right, to teach students that there's some sort of controversy, scientific controversy around evolution.
So if any of our viewers see it happening in their schools, they can contact us and we'll stop it?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
We will.
So we're almost out of time. We have one last question from Jim Foltz, F-O-U-L-T-Z. Do you have any thoughts about the new reports of Catholic priests sexually abusing children? How can they pretend to have a moral high ground after covering up this disgusting abuse? Well, that's a different topic, isn't it?
I have some thoughts, but that's a pretty good idea for a whole separate episode. We're reading the report now.
I'm reading the report this morning. It's awful.
The Pennsylvania Attorney General
report. I'm writing about it. We're actually gonna be helping push legislation and stuff on this. The bottom line is, the most important thing to take away from that is that it's time to quit the Catholic Church. If you are still a member of the Catholic Church, you are complicit in all this. It's time to quit the Catholic Church.
Yeah, but that's a whole nother topic, and we'll be digging into that unfortunate, horrifying report. And stay tuned for more.
Well, thank you for watching FFRF's Ask an Atheist, here with Liz Cavell and with Andrew Seidel, constitutional experts on state-church separation. We're going to do the show again next week on another topic. So we want to remind you before we close today that our convention in San Francisco will be November 2 through 4. The speakers include the eminent writer Salman Rushdie, the former director of Planned Parenthood, Cecile Richards, the Mythbusters host, he's very popular, Adam Savage, the actor John Delancey, who played Q on the Star Trek TV series, Ex-Muslims of North America co-founder Sarah Hayder, the award-winning stand-up comedian Leanne Lord, and the irreverent actress and Saturday Night Live alum Julia Sweeney. Also appearing will be Ensaf Haidar, the activist wife of a Saudi freethinker whose persecution and imprisonment have caused global outrage. She'll be at our convention. You can register online today at ffrf.org/outreach/convention. If you want to receive FFRF text alerts on your smartphone, you can send the text FFRF to 52886. Data rates might apply. Again, that's FFRF to 52886. And we'll see you next week for another episode of FFRF's Ask an Atheist.